He came, he saw, and he damn well conquered. He was the greatest of them all, and that greatness in the end led to a bloody conspiracy that would shake Rome to its very foundation. This is the story of Julius Caesar. He was born on July 12, 100 BC, to a family who lived in considerable comfort. His father, Gaius Julius Caesar, was a senator and the governor of Asia, and his mother, Aurelia Cotta, also came from a well-off family. Julius had two older sisters named Julia Major and Julia Minor. We don't know much about his early years since these ancient biographers left that part out of their books, but what's certain is that no one could have guessed that this little boy would one day turn into the most famous man in Rome. Nothing in his family history pointed to stunning feats of conquest and devastating political potency. What we do know is that during his childhood, Roman politicians were split in two different factions. They weren't official political parties though, and were much more in line with strategies and certain ideologies. The sides were the optimates, whose influence was based in the Roman Senate and the upper classes, and the populares, or populists, whose political strength lay more with the masses and the public assemblies. Their differences would spill enough blood to fill every last bath in Rome. One of the biggest influences on the young Julius was his uncle, Gaius Marius, a brilliant general who had startling victories in wars against the so-called savages in Europe and as far away as North Africa. Caesar's close relationship with his uncle further cemented when, at the age of just 16, his father died, apparently while putting on a pair of running shoes. This was a hell of a violent time in Rome, something that shaped Caesar forever. He watched on as his uncle Marius fought in the Social War, and he beheld him fighting against his arch-rival, Lucius Cornelius Sulla. In short, Sulla belonged to the Optimates and Marius to the Populares, and they went toe-to-toe in what's now called Sulla's Civil War. Sulla won and made himself the dictator of Rome, while Uncle Marius was exiled to Africa. He'd return 3 years later and commit himself to a reign of terror in Rome. To say this was a fiery time would be an understatement, with each side slaughtering their enemies. But what's important in terms of Caesar's influences is how Marius treated his soldiers. He gave them land and citizenship, creating a more professional army that answered only to their commander, not the republic itself. Prior to these reforms, conscripted soldiers were more of a ragtag bunch, low paid, and after their battles, their regiments disbanded, hoping they'd be able to acquire some loot on the way. If they survived the conquest, they often returned home after years away with nothing to show for it. Their lack of presence back home on the farm meant they were likely even poorer than when they left. This was hardly a standard that would create a loyal and professional army if those conscripts were recalled. Caesar saw how after his uncle's reforms made so-called citizen soldiers into loyal fighting machines, men would give everything for the cause and fully embraced what was asked of them by the respected commanders. This transformed the Roman army. It was these skilled fighters whose lives were now steeped in career combat that gave Rome the outstanding military successes it became renowned for. This is a complicated tale, but the short version is that Marius died and Sulla was the top dog in town again. By this time, the young Caesar was already married to Cornelia, daughter of the influential and sometimes tyrannical consul Lucius Cornelius Cinna. Cinna had been aligned with Marius until he was murdered by his own soldiers over what historians said was not politically motivated but rather over some heated disagreement. So where did this leave Caesar, nephew of Marius and husband of another enemy? We should say it was these two men who had initiated bloody purges against Sulla when he was fighting outside of Rome. They might have now been both dead, but Sulla wasn't about to forget their connection to Caesar. It was a precarious time for the young man. Sulla butchered many of his enemies in Rome, a legal kind of killing called proscription. It was invented by Sulla, who said enemies of the state were fair game for execution. As you'll see, this became popular again under another brutal period many years later. Anyway, you could say that Caesar was lucky to have not ended up on that same heap of dead bodies. Every day, Sulla posted more names of people on the wall who he said should have their land confiscated or be executed, and Caesar's name never joined the list. Sulla put bounties on men's heads, and once those heads had been chopped off, he used them for decoration. Then, after filling the Senate with men only loyal to himself, he was pretty much untouchable. It's thought between 1,000 and 9,000 upper-class Romans were murdered in these purges, but Caesar's punishment was not so severe. He was told to divorce his wife. He didn't do that, but he also lost his inheritance and his dowry, both taken under the orders of Sulla. It's surprising that Sulla didn't just have him murdered when he had the chance, given that he ordered Caesar's uncle Marius, his corpse, to be taken from its crypt, torn up, dragged around the city, and thrown into a river. Caesar did, however, have to get out of town for a while. Understanding the gravity of the situation, he did the sensible thing and joined the army. He fought in 2 campaigns and won himself the Civic Crown, the second highest military decoration in the Republic. It was during these campaigns that he needed the fleet belonging to King Nicomedes of Bithynia, although it seems he spent quite a long time with the king, which led to rumors that the two had been in a sexual relationship. Was this true? We can't say, but Caesar did become known as not just the bald adulterer, but also in some circles the Queen of Bithynia. As some historians have pointed out, when Caesar came, saw, and conquered, sometimes it was in a sexual sense, as we'll show you further on in the show. Sulla, after adopting many reforms that suited him and his Roman elite friends, stepped down as dictator. But soon after he put his feet up in his retirement, he was struck by a terrible fever and died. Another story has it that he boozed day and night and lived a life of utter decadence, which ended with liver failure and possibly a ruptured gastric ulcer. Same story says he hemorrhaged from the mouth just as he was ordering someone's strangulation, which you have to admit is better tale than a fever. The year was 78 BC and Caesar was just 22 years old. Knowing he was safe, Caesar went back to Rome, where it said he lived in a fairly average neighborhood. It was during this period that he turned to law, often giving moving speeches about Rome's vast corruption. The great Roman statesman Cicero took a note, once saying about Caesar, "Come now, what orator would you rank above him?" Cicero wasn't a bad talker either, and Caesar knew that, so he went over to Rhodes in Greece to study with Cicero's former rhetorician teacher, Apollonius Milon. He never even got there though, because as he was sailing across the Aegean Sea, his ship was boarded by a bunch of Cilician pirates. Cilicia was in present-day Anatolia in Turkey. It would turn out that this was some really bad luck for the pirates. Although, how could they know that some smooth-talking 25-year-old would turn into quite the formidable foe? As you know, Caesar had already made a bit of a name for himself, but he was far from being famous in Rome. Still, when the pirates told him about the ransom they were asking for him, he told them that they should double the price, even though it was Caesar that would be footing the bill. He was apparently not set back at all by the kidnapping, telling the pirates that their day would come. Caesar sent some of his entourage out to get the ransom money while he was held captive by the pirates, who spent all day mocking him. They soon changed their tune though, with historians saying the pirates suddenly started being ordered around by Caesar. He gave them speeches and read poems, and they listened intently, or at least that's how the legend goes. It's unlikely that the historians would have said Caesar was scared senseless and sat in a puddle of his own pee all day. The history books say he played games with the pirates and always spoke to them as if they were his own subordinates. When they annoyed him, he told them he'd have them all crucified. They apparently thought it was a joke. It wasn't. You don't joke about crucifixion in Rome, that's for sure. It took 38 days to get the ransom money, and when it was handed over, the pirates did as they said they would, and they released the cheeky young man who they all agreed was fun but had a bit of a chip on his shoulder. He certainly did. Caesar somehow managed to raise an entire fleet, not in Rome, but in the ancient Greek city of Miletus. It was some fleet, given he really didn't know anyone there and had no political status. With the ships ready, Caesar said, "All right, boys, that way." Didn't take long to find the pirates, who quite stupidly had stayed on the same island. Caesar had them all put on board and transported to the Greek city of Pergamon, where they were quickly put in chains and sent to prison. Still feeling some loss of face from the ordeal, Caesar wanted them all executed, but Marcus Junctus, the governor of Asia, refused to do so and said the pirates were to be slaves. "Why waste a bunch of healthy men by executing them?" he said. Caesar didn't see it that way, and he later secretly returned to the pirates and had them all crucified, just as he promised. He at least showed some mercy and cut their throats first. Again, remember, we're talking about legends. Mercy's often right up there with bravery as an attribute of a great ruler. Still, you can't deny that Caesar was special. Otherwise, on his return to Rome, he wouldn't have been given the title of a member of the military tribune, which was then a foot in the door of becoming involved in serious Roman politics. One of Rome's most formidable enemies was Mithridates VI Eupator, the king of Pontus, an exemplary conqueror himself. Pontus, by the way, is in present-day northern Anatolia. The great Mithridates was now in another war with Rome. It's here where the ambitious Caesar saw his chance to prove his greatness. He raised his own army and set off to repel Mithridates. The smooth-talking Caesar was later elected as a quaestor, which was kind of a public official. He might have been made up by this, but probably a bit downcast too, as at that point his wife died. Still, it seems he had some other things on his mind, because as the story goes, it was around this time that he saw a statue of Alexander the Great and realized he'd done very little in his life for his own age. Alexander had conquered half the world in his 20s. Caesar was embarrassed by his own shortcomings. He did, however, succeed in quite a few ventures. After borrowing a ton of money, he helped to build public works and roads, including paying for a costly reconstruction of the Appian Way, where thousands of slaves had earlier been crucified. They'd fought for the slave Spartacus in his now famous revolt. They lost, but not after they'd given the Romans hell. But Caesar still wanted more, much more, and so he ran for the position of Pontifex Maximus, which was pretty much the most sought-after position in ancient Rome. Let's just say that he and the other two men in the running did their fair share of bribing, but Caesar came out victorious despite accumulating massive debts during his campaign. Caesar was now powerful, but hardly the world changer he was about to become. It was after this that a man named Lucius Sergius Catilina, a soldier and a senator, conspired with others to take over the Republic by dealing with all the aristocrats in the Senate. This plan was thwarted, but the question is, was Caesar one of the co-conspirators? Some thought he was, perhaps more so because he argued against the death penalty during the proceedings. Then at some point during the debate, someone handed Caesar a note. A man that would become an enemy of Caesar, Marcus Porcius Cato, saw that and demanded to see the note. Turns out it was nothing more than a love letter, but Caesar now had a good idea of who was against him. The conspirators were eventually executed, but only by the skin of his teeth was Caesar granted his innocence after another trial. It seems he was never far away from scandal those days. One of them involved the populist and rabble-rouser named Publius Clodius. One evening, this guy sneaked into Caesar's house during a ceremony only for women to seduce Caesar's now wife. Clodius, even though dressed up as a woman, was found out. The only major outcome was Caesar asking for a divorce. You get the picture by now. Caesar's life was anything but a quiet one. He was given the governorship of Hispania, and there he led some successful military campaigns against two tribal groups. For that, he was called the Imperator by his men, meaning their commander. Caesar's soldiers had great respect for him, which is an important matter as we go on. The problem was all the debt that he racked up, and so he turned to who was known as the richest man in Rome. That man was Marcus Licinius Crassus, one of the key figures in this story. Crassus was a general and a statesman who took advantage of the real estate market and was later praised for his victory in Spartacus's slave revolt. This was a good friend to have, and that friendship would greatly influence history. With his debts paid by Crassus and a fair bit of loot from his conquests, Caesar returned to Rome and some amount of applause. He was officially designated as Imperator, and his victories were publicly celebrated, something called a Roman triumph. A triumph was about as good as it gets, but to accept it, he would have to have stayed a soldier. So he couldn't do that, because he also wanted to be a consul, the highest elected position in Rome. Again, there was a lot of bribery going on during the election, and you can bet many of the people were engaged in corrupt practices to ensure Caesar would not become consul. He still won though, as did the old-school conservative named Marcus Bibulus. These two would forever remain enemies. Remember, Caesar was kind of the opposite to the conservatives. He was a progressive, a so-called man of the people, and many of the people, especially the soldiers that fought under him, were devoted followers. That still made Caesar tons of enemies among the established elites. Caesar needed friends in high places in this viper's nest that was Roman politics, and as you know, he already had one in Marcus Moneybags Crassus, but he found another one in one of the most remarkable and ruthless generals in all of Roman history. That was Gnaeus Pompeius Magnus, better known as Pompey the Great. Just to give you an idea about this guy's ruthlessness, when he was starting out, he got the name Adolescentius Carnifex, meaning teenage butcher. For his many stunning victories, he was awarded 3 Roman triumphs. If there was a man who didn't want to come up against, it was Pompey. And one day, Caesar would have to do just that. It became one of the biggest beefs in ancient history. But for now, Caesar managed to persuade Pompey to take his side. Pompey even agreed to ally with Crassus, even though the two had never really gotten along. They'd both been lieutenants of Sulla back in the day, but since then had fallen out for various reasons. Still, Caesar convinced both guys they needed each other, and a secret pact was made. They made a mighty trio, or as it became known, the first triumvirate. Just you wait until you hear about the second triumvirate. To make matters even better, Pompey married Caesar's only child, Julia. Caesar also got hitched again, but it seems tying the knot didn't really mean much to him. It wouldn't be long until he'd have one of the most infamous affairs in human history. What's important, though, is that his wife was the daughter of another very powerful man, which was never a bad thing in ancient Rome. If Caesar wanted support from the public, he certainly ticked the right boxes. With help from his secret allies, Pompey and Crassus, he passed a law to redistribute public land to the poor. It was only then that the people realized those 3 guys were working together, which, as you can imagine, was a huge threat to other powerful men in Rome. Cut a long story short, these 3 guys were killing it, and Caesar himself now had 4 legions under his control. He was ready for some conquest, and by God, was he about to shake up half of Europe. No one had ever done anything near to what Caesar was about to do, not in Rome anyway. Caesar was about to become an equal to Alexander the Great. No longer would he have to sit in the shadow of that statue. He still had some debts, and he knew Gaul was where the money was at. This was an area covering modern-day France, Germany, Switzerland, and the Netherlands, Belgium, Luxembourg, and northern Italy. It was also home to a lot of tribes, some of which Caesar intended to conquer, and some he'd make alliances with. There's no walk in the park defeating them, especially the Germanic tribes, but Caesar's men had better weapons and were more advanced when it came to strategic warfare. Man for man, horse for horse, the Gallic tribes were just as good, if not better, but Caesar had the brains. The Romans also had solidarity and leadership, and the Germanic tribes had always fought between themselves. Had they united, it would have been a different story. But ain't that always the case? After subjugating more tribes and enforcing Roman rule, Caesar made plans to enter Britain, something no Roman had done before. The first incursion didn't go so well, since he didn't know the land, and in no time after causing a fair bit of damage, he returned to the relative safety of Gaul. King Vercingetorix of the Auvergne tribe did succeed in doing some uniting, and did beat Caesar's army at the Battle of Gergovia, but in the end the Romans were victorious. This had been some undertaking, with ancient historians later writing that Caesar had fought against 3 million men from various tribes, of which a third were killed and a third were enslaved. The claim, while disputed these days, was that Caesar and his men took 800 cities in a total of 300 different tribes. Disputed or not, it was still some victory. Caesar would never conquer Britain in his lifetime, but the Romans would rule there later, although with a giant wall to keep those from the far north out. These Gallic wars, including many of the revolts, had gone on for 8 years. As you can now understand, a lot can happen in Rome in 8 years. In 8 Roman months, there was usually enough backstabbing and scandal to fill a small library. Caesar was well aware that in his absence someone would be plotting his downfall, which is why he used a lot of his looted money to buy powerful friends back home. Still, those not on the payroll were either angry or envious, spreading gossip about Caesar's military adventurism abroad. That triumvirate, too, was also becoming frayed. They managed to patch things up with a meeting in Gaul, but it was about to come undone. Caesar's conquests in Gaul weren't just about Roman expansion. Caesar was selfishly building a faithful army, and with that and his new prestige, he could set about reorganizing things in Rome. Finally, he was ready to go back home. But there were tensions rising back there. Caesar's only daughter, Julia, died while giving birth. Remember, it was this woman that was married to Pompey, and that connection between Caesar and him was an important one. Caesar offered him his great niece, but Pompey said, "Nah, no thanks, bud." This guy had his own ambitions. Then the other part of the triumvirate, Crassus, who was not in the same league as Caesar and Pompey when it came to warfare, died in battle. He and his son and much of his army were absolutely slaughtered fighting the Parthians at the Battle of Carrhae in a part of Turkey. It was a humiliating defeat, and later Crassus was roundly criticized for his greed and lack of military prowess. Despite having the stronger army, he and his men were lured into the desert where arrows rained down from the sky. His commanders told him to negotiate with the Parthians, but when he attempted, Crassus was slain by General Serena. Rome was humiliated, with rumors going around that the Parthians had poured molten gold down Crassus's throat to symbolize his utter greed. Another rumor was that his head was used as a prop in a play at the wedding party of the Parthian king's son. Whatever happened caused turmoil in Rome. The triumvirate was done, and now Caesar and Pompey both vied for power in Rome. Civil war loomed, so the Senate discussed the possible disarmament of both Caesar and Pompey. This gained a lot of support, but in the end the vote was not passed, even after the Senate had received a proposal from Caesar himself, stating that both he and Pompey should lay down their arms at the same time. It was around then that the consul named Gaius Claudius Marcellus asked Pompey if he wanted command of a massive force all over Italy and the power to raise a bigger army. Pompey accepted, and he was the man the nobility preferred, so it was looking like much of the power in Rome was turning against Caesar. He was soon told that he'd be declared an enemy of the state if he didn't put down his arms. But let's just remember here that Caesar, man of the people, had the loyalty of a large army, men who'd fought by his side with him for a number of years. On January 10th, 49 BC, a historical event took place. That was Caesar and his army marching across a small river called the Rubicon in present-day northern Italy. He only took one legion, Legio 13 Gemina. It was one of his best. This was not the outcome that anyone really wanted. Caesar didn't want a civil war, and neither did Pompey. And for that matter, neither did a lot of the nobility. But Caesar was between a rock and a hard place. Had he laid down his arms, what would he have ultimately faced? He was a powerful man now, and he didn't want to give that up. At that same time, the old regime of nobles wanted to cling to their own power, in a Rome that was quickly changing. They believed Caesar was one of the reasons for this turning tide, accusing him of aspirations to rule over Rome and its growing territories. But Caesar had negotiated with Rome, going so far as to ask for the minimum in terms of demands that would keep him safe. He was turned down, so what choice did he have? At the same time, while Pompey didn't want a civil war, you can bet he was incredibly envious of Caesar's many successes. It's said at this point Caesar said the immortal words, "Alia iacta est," let the die be cast. And cast it was. Members of the Senate ran in fear as Caesar marched on Rome. Pompey and his army also fled, not confident in their ability to fight Caesar and his legion. In pursuit of Pompey and Hispania, Caesar left Rome in the hands of the Roman politician and general Mark Antony, one of the stars of this story, whose life was certainly a complicated one. We like him. He was a good general. He seemed loyal. He just had some bad habits that led to him making some bad decisions. We'll come back to him soon. After running Pompey out of Spain, Caesar fought with Pompey's men at the Battle of Dyrrhachium in present-day Albania. Caesar now had legions close by in Greece, and he needed them to support support his war effort, while Pompey had also raised more troops. As Caesar's men hunkered down, supplies were low. Pompey knew that he could wait it out and let Caesar's men succumb to hunger. Pompey had the advantage, being high up and also in a position to receive more supplies from the sea. Things at this point were looking very bad for Caesar, his troops inland having to rely on foraging. Pompey, now believing he had won, built a fort overlooking Caesar's much smaller army. The winter was harsh for Caesar's men, but Pompey was also about to face some hardships himself. Caesar started cutting off streams, the water supplies to the fort, and soon disease was rife in Pompey's camps. Later, Caesar almost completely encircled Pompey, hoping that the general would have no choice but to flee into the sea. There was intermittent fighting between the sides, but this was more about waiting. For now, anyway. Soon, a battle commenced, and it looked as though Pompey had the upper hand. Caesar was forced to retreat, having lost a large number of men. He knew he could have lost, but for some reason, Pompey had ordered a halt in the attack. Famously, Caesar said Pompey's forces would have won today if only they were commanded by a winner. Caesar had lost close to 1,000 men, and those that were captured were executed on the orders of one of Caesar's most trusted lieutenants who had gone over to fight for Pompey. As Caesar and his men retreated, they asked for entrance into the city of Gumphy. They were roundly turned down, only for a furious Caesar to attack the town and kill many of its inhabitants. The leaders in Gumphy had made the mistake of thinking it was better to side with the Pompeians, thinking Caesar was as good as beaten. Word soon got around that if Caesar turns up at your gates, you better let him in. Back in Rome, many people wanted Pompey to either return home and protect Rome or to endeavor to launch a full-scale attack on Caesar. He did neither, and instead he waited for more troops from Syria. He got his backup, and the biggest battle was about to begin. On August 9th, Caesar's experienced legions met in Greece with Pompey's much bigger Republic army at the Battle of Pharsalus. Pompey was confident, but he still was hesitant. It was very likely his officers convinced him that he was ready to attack. Spoiler alert, he wasn't. Caesar had around 22,000 Roman legionnaires from 8 different legions, as well as something close to 1,000 German and Gallic cavalry. Pompey's army was in the realm of 40,000 strong, with an estimated 5,000 to 7,000 cavalry. It was a giant force made up of Roman men as well as Germans, Gauls, Greeks, Jews, Syrians, Phoenicians, and Thracians. Many of these men were ordered to fight by their own rulers who answered to Rome. It was basically everyone versus Caesar, but Caesar, as you know, had highly skilled and eternally loyal fighters. Under the orders of Mark Antony and Gnaeus Domitius Calvinus, Caesar's infantry made a move, followed by a sneaky, well-hidden attack that took Pompey's cavalry off guard. Caesar ordered his men to use their javelins to pick off Pompey's men, and when Caesar's own cavalry advanced, it turned into a massacre. Of Pompey's cavalry that was killed, many retreated, leaving his infantry exposed. Caesar ordered more of his battle-hardened men to attack, and suddenly Pompey's much larger army was on the verge of losing. Caesar gave Pompey's men no quarter after capturing them, killing almost every last one of them. Pompey's army was in total disarray when Caesar gave the order to capture the Pompeian camp. It was a bloodbath, in spite of Pompey's men making a valiant defense. The battle was won by the much smaller side, with Caesar claiming he only lost about 200 regular men and 30 of his commanders. When later asked how this unbelievable victory happened, he said it helps when you know the names of every last commander, or as the Romans called them, centurions. You can now understand the influence his late uncle Marius had on him. Yet again, Pompey fled. Rome now knew who was the boss, although Caesar was a rational man, a forgiving man, and he said anyone who asked for mercy would be spared. He believed there was no point in mass executions, just as Sulla had done. He forgave most of those who had been against him in Rome, including the politician Marcus Junius Brutus. Don't forget that name. We'll just say right now that Brutus had actually been an ally of Caesar. But due to Caesar not always doing what the Senate wanted, he switched his alliance to Pompey during the Civil War. Despite this, Caesar let him live and allowed him to stay in the Senate. But we're getting ahead of ourselves here. Where was Pompey? The answer to that question is in Egypt, a place where he wrongly thought that he'd be offered protection by King Ptolemy XIII. Back when this guy's father was in charge, he'd been told that when the time came, he'd marry his older sister, Cleopatra, a woman famed for her beauty. Although, we'll challenge that. She was nothing special. She was more brains than beauty, and when it started looking like she wore the pants in the co-rulership, Ptolemy arranged to have her murdered. She subsequently fled to Syria and raised an army, hence the breakout of a civil war. Pompey should have known better because shortly after he was taken under Ptolemy's protection, the king had him killed. He believed this would put him in Caesar's good books. But when Caesar arrived in Egypt and was shown Pompey's head, he was less than pleased. After all, Pompey was a great Roman general. Decapitation was just not fitting for such an esteemed man. Caesar ordered that Pompey be be given a proper Roman funeral. Meanwhile, he said that Pompey's assassins should be executed, and the king was asked to make a rather large payment. Caesar also tried to fix the rift between brother and sister. We should mention at this point, Caesar wasn't with a large part of his legions and not all of his best commanders. It's estimated he had around 3,000 infantry and 800 Germanic cavalry. Soon after, they were attacked in the siege of Alexandria, which saw Ptolemy and his allies much larger armies against the armies of Caesar. It was at some point during this siege that Caesar met Cleopatra, and the two fell in love. Well, maybe. Or more likely, Cleopatra was wielding her intelligence unbeknownst to Caesar. They got it on, and while Caesar still recommended she and her brother share the throne, Ptolemy rightly concluded that Caesar might have taken sides. Caesar, somewhat rattled by everything that was going on, ordered his men to destroy the Alexandrian fleet. They did that to some extent and also badly damaged the Great Library, but the Alexandrians soon had 27 warships at the ready to face Caesar's 19 warships and a bunch of smaller ships. The Romans got the upper hand, forcing the Alexandrians to retreat, although in a later scrap, Caesar could easily have lost his life in the battle for Pharos. At one point, he had to relieve himself of his armor and jump into the sea to escape an onslaught. Although later, with the help of thousands of Jewish reinforcements, Caesar was finally victorious. The short story is, Ptolemy drowned sometime later and Cleopatra became ruler of Egypt along with her other brother Ptolemy XIV. She and Caesar remained in a relationship despite him being married in Rome. They had a bastard child, Caesarion, and he took her to Rome on a few occasions, not as a lover but a client. Talk about the scandal as they both vacationed in Caesar's villa. Now the dictator of Rome, in fairly quick succession, Caesar achieved many resounding military victories. The first was against Pharnaces II, king of Pontus. It was an absolute annihilation, which according to Caesar took no more than 4 hours. That's when he uttered those famous words, Vini Vidi Vici, I came, I saw, I conquered. His next routing was in Africa. But all the time Caesar was away, his enemies in Rome, always jealous of his achievements, criticized him and said this guy's ego is through the roof. They feared he'd have way too much power. Yet, some of those were people he'd shown mercy to, which actually is one of the reasons for Caesar's downfall. He could be brutal when it came to the barbarians, but he was often way too kind when it came to his foes in Rome. Amazing games with exotic animals and fearless gladiators were held, and there was much blood and merriment. Caesar was certainly celebrated by the masses, but his opponents were miffed that he should have had a triumph for his victory in the Civil War. They said triumph should not be held when the defeated party, in this case, wasn't a foreign army but the Romans. They also didn't like the fact that he'd made himself dictator in perpetuity. That means forever. At this point, he was ushering in quite big changes in legislation, much of it in favor of the poor and certainly in favor of his military veterans. He changed the calendar system too, as well as reformed the taxation system. This was all pretty progressive, but you could say it didn't go down well with some of those other nobility. Then when he filled the Senate with new people aligned with himself and put term limits on governorships, well, some people secretly reviled him. Many of those reforms, of course, were put into place to cement his eternal power. He was doing what all dictators do, making himself beyond reproach. Then there was his diss of senators at the temple of Venus Genetrix, when he refused to stand up while they gave him gifts to show their appreciation. This was made worse when he told them to their faces that he'd had enough of honors and perhaps it was time to cut back on that kind of thing. Ouch! It seemed as if he didn't just care not about gifts, but he was openly mocking the Senate. Then there were his actions again in the tribunes. Tribunes were your everyday working-class plebeians that had lower rank status in the Roman government. One day, Caesar saw some of them taking a diadem, like a crown, from the top of a statue of Caesar. They decided this was not in line with customs, since the diadem was not for a politician but a king or a god. Later, Caesar was riding down the Appian Way on his horse when one of his devoted fans shouted out the word Rex, meaning king. Caesar put the man straight and replied, I am not Rex, but Caesar. That man in the crowd was then arrested by the tribunes. So, there were now 2 incidences with the tribunes, and both annoyed Caesar. He then announced that from now on, there would be no tribunes in the Senate. This was a bad move in terms of public relations. It was the tribunes that represented the working folk. People in the streets said things such as, and I thought he was supposed to be with us. Man of the people, my ass. Then came the worst thing. Caesar was at a fertility festival called Lupercalia, and at some point during the celebration, Mark Antony put a crown on his head saying, the people give this to you through me. As you know, crowns weren't for dictators. Some people were shocked into silence, a few clapped, and some started whispering, who does he think he is? Tongues wagged, even though to Caesar's credit he took off the crown and said, Jupiter alone of the Romans is king. Some people later said Caesar had set the whole thing up, just to gauge the crowd's reaction so he might know if they wanted him to be king. Just so you know, Romans had gotten rid of kings and replaced rulership with a more modern kind of government. Kings, they agreed, were dangerous. On the evening of February 22nd, 44 BC, somewhere in the shadows, two men machinated about a certain downfall. One was Brutus, who you already know Caesar had spared. The other was his brother-in-law, the senator named Cassius Longinus. They decided that killing Caesar wasn't good enough, seeing as Caesar was still well-liked by the people. They didn't want a revolt. They agreed that Caesar's death should be at the hands of a large group of men, and then they could announce that they'd only murdered a tyrant for the good of Rome. Almost like picking a jury, they went through a list of powerful men. The assassins, they decided, should include some senators close to their own age of 40. The difficult thing was to bring such a thing up in conversation. After all, tell the wrong person you intend to assassinate the leader, and that would not only foil the plot but get you killed. So they decided to ask questions like this. Okay, hypothetically, just hypothetically speaking, if a certain man was like an evil ruler of people and caused much damage to his land, do you think like A, his people should rise up and kill him, or maybe B, you should just let sleeping dogs lie? Remember, hypothetically speaking. In the end, they got around 60 people to agree with the assassination, folks from all sorts of backgrounds. But most who had a beef with Caesar were skeptical of his growing authoritarianism or felt that they hadn't been rewarded enough by him. Some were merely peeved that Caesar had been too kind to folks that had once supported Pompey. He had plenty of enemies, that's for sure. They even thought about trying to enlist Mark Antony, but it was decided that Antony wouldn't go for it. They also wondered if they should kill Antony, and while they were on the topic, they asked if they should also undo all of Caesar's reforms. Now that wouldn't work, it turned out, because some of the assassins actually liked the reforms. Still, most of them were good with getting rid of Antony. Brutus then said the sensible thing. He told the others that if they killed Antony, the people would start asking too many questions. Antony was no tyrant, said Brutus, and the people knew that. Brutus also said if they reversed the reforms, people would ask if the assassination was because of a tyrant or because some greedy men wanted their own way. It was finally agreed that they would keep the reforms, spare Antony, and only kill the man that they say wanted to be king. Okay, so how would they get the job done? They mulled over a few murder plots. Some men said, just do it on the streets, a daggers in the heart scenario. Easy. Others said, no, nothing public, and offered the proposal of throwing him over a bridge, and when he landed in the water, stabbing the hell out of him. This also sounded a bit messy to some of them. Someone else ventured that they should kill him quickly at the gladiatorial games when the place was erupting in chaos. Then no one would know what was going on. It was finally agreed that the best course of events would be to get him at one of the Senate meetings. This was pretty much the only time he wasn't surrounded by friends, people that knew how to fight. The other senators, though, the ones forever allied with Caesar, couldn't punch their way through a paper bag, or whatever was the expression in ancient Rome. It would also look much nobler, doing it at a meeting rather than down an alley or in a river. The 15th of March was picked, in which the Roman calendar was the Ides of March. A date for Romans was often reserved for paying back debts. Caesar had visited a seer around this time, and the seer had told him his life was in danger. It's thought Caesar also knew something strange was going on around him. Everyone looked suspicious. Then one day Caesar said to an aide, "What do you think Cassius is up to? I don't like him. He looks pale." When the big day came, the senators and some others turned up for the meeting held at the Senate House of Pompey, which was in the Theater of Pompey. Nearby, gladiators were preparing for the games. That made the plotters confident, knowing that if they met with resistance, they could get them on their side. One of the leading conspirators was Decimus Brutus, a man who had his own team of gladiators. They waited and waited, but Caesar didn't come. The reason could be a legend, but it said that Caesar's wife had awoken him that morning and pleaded with him not to leave. She said she just had a nightmare in which he'd been murdered. Another story says she dreamed of a river of blood oozing from Caesar's body. It seems she did indeed have some kind of bad dream, because the historians say after Caesar decided not to go and asked Antony to cancel the meeting, gladiator owner Decimus turned up at his house. After hearing Caesar's reasons for shutting down the meeting, he said, "What do you say, Caesar? Will someone of your stature pay attention to a woman's dreams and the omens of foolish men?" Antony followed Caesar and the others to the meeting, but as soon as they were in the door, someone grabbed Antony and shoved him into another room. He must have known right then he'd never see his friend alive again. Caesar, not knowing what was happening, took a seat and was handed a petition to review. Most people around him were his enemies, all of them with daggers at the ready. What cowards they were about to kill a defenseless man, the greatest man Rome had seen and would ever see. It was Senator Kimber that made the first move, grabbing at Caesar's toga and pulling it down. Caesar shouted, "Why this violence?" Then Senator Casca brandished his dagger, viciously inserting it in Caesar's back. Blood spurted out in streams. Caesar grabbed him and said, "Casca, you villain, what are you doing?" Then they all piled in, including Brutus, and it was stab after stab after stab, 23 hits in total. But the one to the aorta was the fatal blow. Caesar died, said the autopsy dropsy from blood loss. He may have had no final words, although some historians wrote that he said, "You too, child?" when he saw Brutus was one of the conspirators. He may have said nothing, and on seeing Brutus, the gravity of such betrayal made him pull his toga over his eyes. Brutus, we're told, was actually a man of morals, and Caesar had known that. Brutus had never actually wanted a bloodbath, but he reckoned, sincerely, Caesar had to be killed for the good of Rome. Many of the conspirators fled from the scene, but some of them walked through the streets shouting, "People of Rome, we are once again free." The people locked their doors, not knowing what to think. Caesar, meanwhile, lay on that cold, hard floor, only moved later by slaves. Many of the lower classes were furious that their beloved Caesar had been felled by a group of greedy aristocrats. They didn't buy into the tale of this being for their own good. Mark Antony realized that this was a good time to exploit the anger and threatened to release the angry mass on the aristocrats. Caesar hadn't had all-out support from the people of Rome, but he had enough devoted followers to ensure this time was fraught with tension. We're missing out on a lot here, but as time passed, some of those plebes got to work burning down the houses of the conspirators. 18-year-old Octavian, Caesar's grandnephew and adopted son, had been made heir by Caesar before his death. Turned out he was a formidable ruler too. We'll come back to his fate soon. War was here again, with Brutus and Cassius both raising armies, and Antony doing the same. In short, Brutus and Cassius lost. A second triumvirate was formed, this one consisting of Antony, Octavian, and Caesar's master of the horse, Marcus Aemilius Lepidus. As for Caesar's enemies, there was no forgiveness this time. It's a long story, but as you know, power vacuums are often very bloody. It was agreed that the second triumvirate should rule various provinces of Rome, and they did so openly and legally, unlike the first triumvirate. Lands were divided, and Octavian married Antony's stepdaughter, Claudia. And later Antony got hitched to Octavian's sister, Octavia. Proscription, which as we said made it legal to banish or execute Romans who'd been condemned, was brought back. This hadn't happened since Sulla was around. Everything might have been hunky-dory if all those men didn't have their own dangerous ambitions and insatiable hunger for power. Lepidus and Octavian fell out over the matter of territories, and Octavian then accused Lepidus of trying to start a rebellion and take all the power for himself. Lepidus lost that argument and ended up being booted out of Rome and exiled to Africa. Antony then ended up with Caesar's old flame, the extremely wealthy Cleopatra. They lived in Alexandria and had kids together, and together with their joint armies they did a fair bit of conquering. Anthony even gave himself a kind of fake triumph and minted coins for his victory. Octavian didn't much like this. Anthony was getting too big for his britches. And then when Octavian got hold of Anthony's will by illegally breaking into the sacred temple of Vesta, he saw that Anthony intended to bequeath a hell of a lot to Cleopatra's kids. He even asked to be buried in Alexandria, not in Rome. Disgraceful, thought Octavian. That was fighting talk, especially when Octavian saw that Anthony and Cleopatra wanted to be queen of kings in the lands of Egypt and Cyprus, and Caesar's bastard son with Cleopatra, Caesarion, to be named king of kings. The upshot was Octavian declaring that Anthony had failed to conduct himself as befitted a Roman citizen. The Battle of Actium was the result of this fallout, sometimes called the final war of the Roman Republic. Turned out that Cleopatra and Anthony were no match for Octavian's forces, not even close, and Cleo and Tony soon perished. Believe it or not, Rome saw quite a long period of peace after that, with Octavian becoming the first ever emperor and initiating what would be called the Golden Age of Rome under the name Pax Romana, Roman peace. Talk about having to break some eggs to make an omelet that Caesar had started. Now, you need to see if Caesar stands up to this guy, Genghis Khan, greatest conqueror ever, or have a look at this.